20 years after the crime. For 2 decades, this particular case lived in boxes, filed away, unsolved, almost forgotten. Investigators believed the truth had died with time. Witnesses disappeared, memories faded, evidence aged into irrelevance. And then a voice broke the silence. Not a suspect under pressure, not a man facing arrest, but someone who walked into the truth calmly and confessed. I did it. All of it. Those 4 words would reopen a case no one thought could be solved. And what followed would shock even the detectives who thought they had seen everything. Why this confession changed everything. 20 years earlier, the crime itself had stunned an entire community. A brutal act, a senseless loss, and an investigation that began with urgency but slowly collapsed under unanswered questions. At the time, detectives chased every lead they had. Friends, family, strangers, but nothing stuck. No solid suspect, no confession, no forensic evidence strong enough to survive court. As years passed, investigators reached a quiet conclusion. If the killer hadn't been caught by now, he probably never would be. The case went cold. That's why this confession was so unexpected. The man who came forward wasn't on any suspect list. He wasn't being watched. He wasn't pressured. And yet he claimed responsibility for everything. But it wasn't just that he confessed. It was how he confessed. The details he knew. The secrets he revealed. Information that had never been made public. What he told investigators didn't just explain the crime. It exposed mistakes, contradicted old theories, and rewrote the entire story from the beginning. Because sometimes the most disturbing truths don't surface during the investigation. They surface decades later, when the person responsible finally decides to speak. The victims, who they were before the crime. Before the headlines, before the police tape, there were people living ordinary lives. They weren't defined by how they died, but by how they lived. They had routines. Morning coffee poured into the same mug, commutes taken without a second thought, evenings spent planning weekends that would never come. One had dreams still in motion, plans to move, to start over, to finally take a chance that had been delayed too long. Another was steady and predictable, the kind of person others relied on, someone who believed tomorrow was guaranteed. Friends described them as kind, dependable, present. No one remembers fear in their voices. No one recalls a warning, because nothing about their lives suggested they were running out of time. There were conversations left unfinished, calls never returned, plans written down that would never be crossed off a list. When people talk about cold cases, they often talk about evidence, but what truly goes cold are futures. The night of the crime. What happened? The night everything changed began like any other. No alarms, no emergency calls, no sign that violence was about to unfold. Investigators would later piece together the timeline minute by minute, not from witnesses, but from what was left behind. At a certain point, contact stopped. Phones went silent. Lights remained on longer than usual. Something happened in the space between normal and irreversible. Police would eventually reconstruct the sequence, step by step, movement by movement, where the victims were last seen, which rooms they entered, where the violence began and where it ended. But even with all that, crucial pieces were missing. No clear struggle heard by neighbors, no forced entry, no obvious trail leading away. Police knew what had occurred, but not who had done it, or why. The crime scene offered answers and contradictions. details that suggested familiarity, others that suggested planning. Every conclusion raised another question. And as the sun rose the next morning, a brutal truth became unavoidable. Whatever happened that night wasn't random. It wasn't impulsive. It was deliberate. And for the next 20 years, that truth would remain locked in silence, waiting for the person responsible to finally speak. In the days following the crime, investigators moved fast. Every call was logged. Every tip was followed. Every name was written down. Attention turned first to the people closest to the victims: friends, former partners, co-workers, anyone with motive, anyone with opportunity. But each lead collapsed under scrutiny. Alibis checked out. Timelines didn't match. Suspects were eliminated one by one. Some theories seemed promising until a single detail didn't fit. Other clues were dismissed too quickly, assumed to be irrelevant, filed away as coincidence. Investigators would later admit, not every question was asked the right way. Not every answer was challenged. Pressure mounted. The public demanded answers. And with every passing week, certainty began to erode, because the more detectives searched, the less they truly knew. Evidence that failed. At the time, technology promised answers, but delivered limitations. DNA testing was still in its infancy. Samples were small. Standards were strict. Results were often inconclusive. What today could be solved in hours took months, sometimes years, and still led nowhere. Some evidence degraded before it could be properly analyzed. Other pieces were tested once and never revisited. Witnesses moved away, memories blurred, key individuals passed on, and with them, crucial details vanished. There were fingerprints that couldn't be matched, fibers that told no story, questions that evidence refused to answer. Each failure chipped away at momentum, until eventually investigators were forced to confront a reality they dreaded. They were running out of time. Without new technology, without new witnesses, without new truth, the case stalled. Files were boxed, leads dried up, and the investigation slowly slipped into silence. The crime hadn't been forgotten, but it had been outpaced by time. And for the next 20 years, justice would remain just out of reach. Life moves on, except for the victims. Time has a way of moving forward whether justice comes with it or not. For the world outside this case, life continued. Jobs changed, children grew older, new families moved into old neighborhoods. But for the families of the victims, time stood still. Every year the same dates returned, birthdays that no longer felt like celebrations, anniversaries marked not by joy, but by absence. They waited for phone calls that never came, for answers that were always promised and never delivered. Some families held on to hope, others learned to live with unanswered questions, but none ever found peace, because closure requires truth, and truth was still missing. Grief didn't fade, it changed shape. It settled into quiet moments, empty chairs, names spoken less often, but never forgotten. The case file gathers dust. Inside the police department, the case slowly slipped out of focus. The detectives who once worked it every day retired, transferred, or passed the responsibility to someone new. With each handoff, details blurred, notes were rewritten, memories replaced by reports, faces reduced to photographs. Eventually, the file was archived, not closed, but shelved, a case technically still open, yet functionally forgotten. Public attention faded too. New crimes replaced old headlines, the stories stopped being told, and silence settled in. But silence doesn't mean resolution, it means waiting. Waiting for something or someone to break it, because even after 20 years, the truth was still alive. It just hadn't been spoken yet. Who he was. For 20 years, investigators searched for a monster.
What they never imagined was how ordinary he looked. He wasn't hiding in the shadows, he wasn't on the run, he lived in plain sight. He had a background that raised no alarms, a steady job, casual friendships, a life that followed predictable routines. People described him as reserved, polite, unremarkable, not someone you feared, not someone you watched. He maintained relationships without deep attachments, kept conversations light, shared little about himself. That distance protected him. There were no violent outbursts, no criminal record, no obvious connection to the victims, and because investigators were looking for chaos, they missed control. A life built on a lie. Avoiding detection wasn't about brilliance, it was about patience. He understood something most criminals don't. Time is the greatest shield. He never spoke about that night, never returned to the scene, never inserted himself into the investigation. He moved on, at least on the surface. But guilt doesn't disappear, it waits. There were signs, small, easily dismissed, sleepless nights, sudden changes in routine, an obsession with news stories about old crimes. He avoided certain places, certain dates, certain questions. Those close to him noticed moments of withdrawal, a heaviness that came and went without explanation, but no one connected the dots. Because guilt doesn't always look like panic. Sometimes it looks like silence. For 20 years, he lived two lives, one that everyone saw, and one that never stopped replaying the truth, and eventually, that truth would demand to be heard. The moment of confession. The day he spoke. After 20 years of silence, the truth didn't surface in a dramatic arrest, it emerged quietly. He was in a place meant for conversation, not confession. No sirens, no handcuffs, no audience, just a room and a decision. He asked to speak to someone, not a lawyer, not a journalist, law enforcement. What followed was calm, controlled, almost unsettling. "I need to tell you something. I've carried it for a long time." Then the words no one expected. "I did it. All of it." Investigators would later describe the moment as surreal. There was no emotion in his voice, no trembling hands, just certainty. He didn't hesitate. He didn't test reactions. He spoke as someone finally unburdening himself. And then he began to talk about details. Details that weren't public. Details that had been buried with the case. That's when the room changed.
Immediate police reaction. At first, skepticism took over. Confessions come in many forms, false ones included. Investigators had seen it before. People seeking attention, people chasing notoriety, people confessing to crimes they couldn't possibly have committed. So, they listened. They didn't interrupt. They didn't react. They let him talk. Then came the turning point. He described locations with precision, actions in sequence, errors investigators had never released publicly, information only the person responsible could know. The skepticism didn't vanish, but it shifted from "is he lying" to "how much of this is true?" Verification began immediately. Files were pulled from storage, evidence was re-examined, timelines were compared. And with every confirmed detail, the weight in the room grew heavier. Because the confession wasn't unraveling, it was holding together. And for the first time in 20 years, the truth was no longer silent. Details only the killer could know. Confessions mean nothing without proof. So investigators did what they hadn't done in 20 years. They challenged every word. They asked him to describe the crime scene, not in broad strokes, but in specifics. He spoke about positions, about timing, about small, easily overlooked details. The location of an object moved after the crime, a sound that occurred at a precise moment, a mistake made in the dark. None of it had been released to the public. Then came the matches. His account aligned with blood pattern analysis, with photographs taken that night, with notes buried deep inside the original case file. Investigators cross-checked everything, and one by one, the pieces fit. This wasn't a story built from headlines, it was a memory. Forensic breakthroughs. Technology had changed. What once failed could now speak. Evidence collected decades earlier, dismissed as inconclusive, was sent back to the lab. DNA samples were retested using modern techniques. Trace materials reanalyzed with precision that didn't exist at the time. The results came back quietly, but the impact was deafening. Profiles matched, timelines aligned, questions answered themselves. There was no longer room for doubt. The confession wasn't just believable, it was verifiable. For the first time since the crime, the case wasn't held together by theory, but by truth. After 20 years, science had finally caught up with silence, and the truth was no longer deniable. Expert analysis, the psychology of delayed confessions. The question investigators couldn't ignore was simple. Why now? Why carry the truth for 20 years, only to speak at the end? Criminal psychologists say delayed confessions are rarely impulsive. They're the result of something building, slowly, quietly, relentlessly. Cut to expert reenactment, psychologist in an office, notes on a desk. Experts explain that some offenders believe time protects them, that as years pass, the risk fades, memories weaken, evidence disappears. But what time erodes externally, it often intensifies internally. Guilt doesn't always arrive immediately. Sometimes it waits until life slows down enough to feel it. For some, confession becomes a way to regain control, to choose how the truth comes out rather than having it discovered. It isn't about forgiveness, it's about release. His breaking point. In his case, multiple pressures converged: age, declining health, the growing awareness that time was no longer on his side. Some close to him noticed changes, a preoccupation with mortality, a sudden interest in faith, questions about legacy. Others believe fear played a role, the fear that someone else would uncover the truth first, or worse, that he would die without ever telling it. Whatever the trigger, something finally broke through the defenses he'd built for decades. The routines that once protected him stopped working. The silence became heavier than the risk. And in that moment, confession wasn't an act of courage, it was an act of surrender. After 20 years of running from the truth, he stopped. Arrest and court proceedings. Once the evidence was confirmed, events moved quickly. Charges were filed, warrants were signed, and after 20 years of silence, the case returned to a courtroom. The arrest was procedural, no resistance, no denial. In court, the details were laid out, methodically, unemotionally. Documents once buried in archives were read aloud. Photographs resurfaced. Testimony filled gaps left by decades of uncertainty. For the first time, the crime had a name attached to it, a face, a responsibility. Justice, delayed, was finally in motion. Victim families react. For the families, the moment carried no single emotion. Relief came first, the relief of knowing the truth. But relief did not erase the past. Some described a sense of closure. Others felt the pain resurface, sharper than before. Because justice answers questions, but it doesn't restore what was taken. The confession ended the mystery, but reopened the grief. Still, there was something they had waited 20 years to hear. An acknowledgement, an admission, a truth finally spoken out loud. It wasn't the ending they wanted, but it was the ending they deserved. Final reflection. For 20 years, this truth lived in silence. It waited in forgotten files, in memories that refused to fade, in the space between what was known and what was feared. Some secrets survive decades. They hide behind routine. They blend into ordinary lives. But secrets carry weight,
And no matter how long they're buried, time has a way of exposing what was meant to stay hidden. Some secrets survive decades, but not forever. What do you think about this confession? Was it driven by guilt, fear, or something else entirely? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments below. Your perspective matters. If this case stayed with you, we've explored other chilling cold cases, stories where the truth surfaced years later and confessions changed everything. Check out the next episode on your screen now. And if you want more deep dives into unsolved mysteries, delayed confessions, and the psychology behind real crimes, subscribe to Criminals Chronicle. Because some stories may be buried, but they're never truly gone.